Your enterprise automation strategy is sitting on a ticking time bomb. You think you're scaling, but in reality, you're just accumulating high-interest technical debt. It's the custom connector trap. On the surface, wrapping a legacy API in a Power Platform wrapper feels like a quick win because it's accessible, low-code, and fast. But by 2026, these triggers are breaking your ability to actually govern your data. Most organizations are paying a fragmentation tax they don't even see, and they're trading structural integrity for short-term speed. The top 1% of architects have already stopped. They aren't just building flows, they're building infrastructure. They're moving away from fragmented, user-owned connectors toward the structural clarity of Logic App Standard. Today, I'm showing you the model behind that shift. We're going to look at how Logic App Standard solves the governance crisis, eliminates the API tax, and finally makes your automation auditable at the transaction level. The custom connector trap. The flaw isn't the tool, it's the assumption. We assumed that if we made it easy to connect to an API, we were enabling the business. In reality, we were just creating Shadow IT 2.0. When you wrap a legacy system in a custom connector within Power Automate, you're creating a black box where you navigate, you search, and you build, but then you lose sight of the data. But here's the problem. The Center of Excellence Starter Kit is the very thing you rely on for oversight, yet it is largely blind to the actual data flow inside those custom definitions. It can tell you the connector exists and it can tell you who owns it, but it can't tell you what that API is actually doing at the packet level. This is where things break. Because business users aren't security architects, they inadvertently create massive security holes by using insecure API definitions or granting excessive permissions to external systems just to make it work. They build a flow to share customer data with a third-party CRM, but they leave the authentication open, and suddenly you have a compliance violation under GDPR or HIPAA that your admin center didn't even flag. And then there's the maintenance treadmill. In most organizations, a vendor changes a JSON template or an API endpoint, and what happens next is a total mess. You have 50 different flows owned by 20 different people who are all using that same custom connector, which means you have to find them, retrain them, and fix them one by one. It's a manual process for an automated world. The easy-to-build promise has become an impossible-to-govern reality. The model is broken because it's centered on the individual maker rather than the enterprise architecture. And while it was built for structure, it lacks context. When you scale, you realize that visibility isn't just a nice-to-have. It's a mandate. If you can't see the dependency, you can't manage the risk. Most architects are realizing that custom connectors are actually a liability because they link your most sensitive Microsoft 365 data to external silos without a central kill switch. You publish the content and you enable the maker, but then nobody uses the governance controls because the controls weren't designed for this level of sprawl. We're seeing 3 to 4 times higher rates of security violations in environments that rely heavily on these fragmented wrappers compared to those using a centralized IPaaS. The mismatch is architectural. Power Automate was designed for simple trigger action logic within the Microsoft ecosystem, so it was never meant to be the primary gateway for your entire legacy API surface area. When you force it to be that gateway, you're building on sand. You're creating a world where an employee leaves the company and 3 mission-critical integrations stop working because the custom connector was tied to their identity or their personal environment. That's not an enterprise strategy. That's a hobby that got out of hand. To fix this, we have to look deeper at the math and understand why the current approach fails, not just on security, but on the balance sheet. Because the real cost of a custom connector isn't the time it takes to build, it's the tax you pay every time it runs. And as we're about to see, that tax is about to become a lot more expensive as your volume grows. The shift to 2026 demands a new model that replaces surface-level wrappers with structural single-tenant isolation. It's time to look at the math of inefficiency. The math of inefficiency. You are paying an API tax that you haven't audited yet. In the multi-tenant world of Power Automate and Logic Apps consumption, every single call comes with a price tag. It looks thin and fractional at first glance. You see $0.000125 per standard call, or perhaps a tenth of a cent for enterprise connectors. It feels like pennies, but in an enterprise environment, those pennies aggregate into a budget crisis. The flaw in this model is that it scales linearly with your success, meaning the more you automate, the more Microsoft bills you. You are essentially being punished for becoming more efficient. This is exactly where the math of the old model breaks down. As of 2026, we have a very clear line in the sand, and it is the 6 million action threshold. If your workflows are executing more than 6 million actions per month, which is roughly 200,000 actions a day, you are officially bleeding money by staying on a consumption-based plan. Think about a standard integration running 13,000 times a day with 15 actions each. That is not a massive workload for a global company, but rather the invoice processing for a single department. On a consumption plan, that results in a variable and unpredictable bill that fluctuates every month. But when you move to Logic App Standard, You switch to the WS1 plan and pay roughly $150 a month for the compute. The hosting becomes a fixed cost. This is the primary differentiator for the architect because in Logic Apps Standard, custom connectors run as built-in extensions. They execute locally within the runtime, which means the cost per call is zero. You have eliminated the variable fee for your most frequent proprietary integrations, and you have moved from a model where costs are unpredictable to one where they are a structural constant. But the inefficiency goes deeper than just execution fees, and we have to talk about the per-user licensing spiral. Power Automate Premium costs roughly $15 to $20 per user, which seems manageable when you have a small team. But what happens when that workflow goes cross-departmental or when your automation needs to touch data owned by 500 different employees? Suddenly, you are looking at a $10,000 monthly commitment just to keep the lights on for a few flows. You are caught in a multiplexing trap where everyone needs a license because the architecture is tied to the individual identity. Logic Apps Standard does not care about your seat count. It is an Azure service built on vCPU and memory, so you can have 10,000 users interacting with the data downstream while your hosting cost stays at that WS1 or WS2 baseline. You are licensing the infrastructure instead of the people. If you want to be aggressive with your ROI, there is a specific 70% savings trick that architects are using in 2026. In your non-production environments like dev, test, and QA, you do not need 24/7 availability. By using scheduled deployment scripts, you can tear down the compute during off hours while keeping the storage account intact. You preserve your run history and keep your state, but you only pay for the hours your developers are actually working. This simple shift cuts your $170 monthly bill down to about $51. Most organizations miss this because they treat automation like a SaaS subscription and they forget it is actually cloud infrastructure. When you treat it like infrastructure, you gain the ability to right-size your plan. You start on WS1, monitor the memory, and if the load spikes, you scale to WS3. You finally have the steering wheel. In the old model, you were just a passenger on a billing cycle you could not control. But to actually unlock these savings, you cannot just move the code because you have to move the network as well. In 2026, cost and security are no longer separate conversations, as they are now joined at the VNet. VNet integration as a governance mandate. The rules for network isolation changed the moment Microsoft retired the integration service environment. In the previous era, you had to pay a massive premium for a dedicated ISE just to get your workflows inside your private network. It was expensive, slow to provision, and clunky to manage. But as we move through 2026, the architectural standard has shifted. The retirement of ISE was not just a lifecycle event, but a mandate to move toward the regional VNet integration model found in Logic Apps Standard. If you are still relying on standard Power Automate flows for enterprise data, you are likely exposing your traffic to the public internet. Most low-code connectors use public endpoints, so when a flow triggers, that data leaves your tenant and travels over the public web. It hits a gateway before it reaches your legacy system, and for an architect, that is a non-starter. You cannot satisfy a zero-trust audit when your primary automation path relies on public IP addresses and shared multi-tenant infrastructure. This is why Logic Apps Standard is the only viable path for regulated industries. By leveraging regional VNet integration, you route all outbound traffic through a dedicated subnet in your own virtual network. You are not just connecting to a database, but rather placing the entire automation runtime inside your security perimeter. This allows you to apply network security groups and firewalls to the traffic, which ensures that your data never touches the open web. But you have to get the plumbing right. The most common failure I see is a lack of planning around subnet sizing, as most teams treat subnets like an afterthought. They grab a /28 or a /29 and assume it is enough, but it is not. In the standard model, you cannot resize a subnet once it is assigned to the plan, and if you undersize it, your scaling will hit a hard wall. The non-negotiable standard for production scaling is a /26 subnet. A /26 gives you 64 IP addresses, and you need that many because Azure reserves 5 IPs immediately. Every instance of your app service plan consumes an IP, and if you are running Windows containers, you are using even more at 1 extra IP per app per instance. During a platform upgrade or a scale-out event, your IP usage temporarily doubles to ensure there is no downtime. If you only have 16 addresses, your workflows will fail the moment the system tries to patch itself. A /26 subnet is your insurance policy against operational outages. Once the outbound path is secured, you have to lock the front door with private endpoints. VNet integration handles how the Logic app talks to the world, but private endpoints handle how the world talks to the Logic app. By assigning a private IP to the Logic app itself, you effectively vanish from the public internet. You can block all inbound calls that do not originate from within your trusted network. This creates a dark integration layer where your automation exists, functions, and scales, but it has no public footprint. This is the level of outbound security that Power Automate simply cannot provide without massive workarounds. When you move to this model, you solve the public internet exposure problem that haunts most citizen developer projects. You move from a reactive posture where you hope your DLP policies catch the leak to a proactive architectural stance where the leak is physically impossible because the network path does not exist. This is not just about security, it is about performance. Built-in connectors in the standard runtime respect these VNet routes natively, so they do not need a gateway or proxy hoops. They talk directly to your SQL servers, your SAP instances, and your private APIs at wire speed. You are finally treating your automation like the production-grade infrastructure it is. Production-grade infrastructure versus citizen chaos. We need to stop pretending that a browser-based designer is a professional development environment. In the Power Platform world, prototyping happens directly in the portal. You drag an action, you drop a trigger, and you save the flow. But in that moment, you've just deployed to production. There is no separation between the idea and the execution, and that is the exact definition of citizen chaos. It's a model built on the hope that the maker didn't make a typo in a live environment. The shift to Logic Apps Standard is a shift toward maturity. It moves the center of gravity from the Azure portal to VS Code. For the first time, your automation is treated like real code. You get a local development experience where you can run, test, and debug your workflows on your own machine before a single byte reaches the cloud. This is where the adults in the room use bicep templates and source control. When your automation is defined as infrastructure as code, you gain a level of resilience that low-code tools can't match. You aren't just clicking buttons because you are committing parameterized deployments to a Git repository instead. If a deployment fails, you don't scramble to remember what you changed. You revert the commit and then you redeploy the previous known good state. This discipline is what allows you to survive a zero-trust audit. But the real game changer in the standard runtime is selective deployment. In a traditional Power Automate solution, if you need to update one flow, you often have to move the entire package. It's an all-or-nothing risk. In Logic Apps Standard, you can target specific workflows within your app. You can push an update to your inventory sync without touching the order processing logic sitting right next to it. You're isolating the change, and you're reducing the blast radius of every update. This is the difference between a fragile system and a resilient one. Most citizen-built automations are incredibly fragile because they are UI dependent. They rely on record and playback or surface-level triggers that break the second a button moves or a CSS selector changes. Logic Apps Standard forces you into an API-driven orchestration mindset. You aren't mimicking a human, which means you are actually orchestrating a system. You move from the look what I built phase of amateur automation to the look what I can reliably maintain for 5 years phase of enterprise architecture. Think about the long-term maintenance of 50 different custom connectors. In the portal, that's a nightmare of checking individual connections and fixing broken authentication tokens. In a parameterized bicep deployment, those connections are managed as environment variables. You swap the client secret in Azure Key Vault and every workflow across your entire dev, test, and production stack updates automatically. You've replaced manual toil with structural automation. This isn't just a technical preference, but a survival strategy for the modern IT department. By 2026, the volume of automation is going to explode. You cannot manage that volume if every flow requires a manual touch in a web designer. You need a pipeline. You need a way to move changes from a developer's laptop to a production environment with zero human intervention. When you adopt Logic Apps Standard, you're finally building for the future. You're moving away from the shadow it model, where mission-critical logic lives in a user's personal environment. You're bringing it into the light of the enterprise integration stack. You're trading the temporary dopamine hit of a fast build for the permanent security of a stable build. It's time to move toward the architect model. The architect model for 2026. The transition we're discussing isn't just a change in hosting. It's a fundamental shift in how we conceptualize the old model versus the new model of enterprise integration. In the old model, we thought in terms of trigger action. Something happens in SharePoint, and therefore we send an email. It's linear, it's simple, and it's exactly where Power Automate thrives. But when you try to force that linear thinking onto a complex business process like a multi-vendor supply chain reconciliation, the logic begins to choke. You end up with spaghetti flows, with dozens of nested conditions that are impossible to troubleshoot. The 2026 architect model moves toward event reasoning orchestration. This is the shift from doing to deciding. Logic Apps Standard is designed for this higher order complexity. It's why the runtime supports both stateful and stateless workflows. You can use stateless flows for high-frequency, low-latency requests where you don't need to keep a record of every single step. For the heavy lifting, you use stateful workflows that provide the durability required for long-running processes that might take days or weeks to complete. But the real power of Logic Apps Standard lies in its extensibility. In the low-code world, if there isn't a pre-built action for what you need, you're stuck. In the standard model, you have the custom .NET code and Azure Functions extensions. You aren't limited by the designer's palette. If you need to perform a complex mathematical calculation or a specific data transformation that would take 50 actions in Power Automate, you simply write a small piece of .NET code and run it in process. It's about using the right tool for the right job. The 2026 strategy isn't about deleting Power Automate. It's about layering your architecture correctly. Think of Power Automate as your front end for automation. Use it for the human-centric tasks, the team's notifications, the mobile approvals, and the simple M365 triggers. These are the edge cases of your business logic. But the core, the mission-critical data pipelines and the legacy system integrations must live in Logic Apps Standard. This layered approach gives you the best of both worlds. You empower the business users to build their own productivity tools on the front end, but you keep the structural integrity of your enterprise data protected within the Logic Apps core. You're essentially building a hub and spoke model for your automation. And then there is the question of auditability. When a regulator asks why a specific invoice was rejected, a simple run history isn't enough. It tells you the flow ran, but it doesn't explain the logic behind the decision, and it certainly doesn't show the why. Logic App Standard allows you to build decision-level logging. Because you have control over the storage and the telemetry, you can emit custom tracking events to log analytics that record the actual business context of every transaction. You can prove that the automation followed the validated procedures required by your industry. You move from hoping it worked to knowing it complied. This level of transparency is what separates a professional architect from a casual maker. You're building a system that is diagnosable. When something goes wrong, and it will, you don't just see a red failed status. You have the telemetry to see exactly where the logic deviated from the expected path. You have the context to fix the root cause instead of just restarting the flow and hoping for a different result. It's time to stop building flows and start building an orchestration layer that actually scales. The migration roadmap. The clock is ticking, but you finally have the blueprints to stop the damage. You cannot simply flip a switch and expect everything to move overnight. It requires a structured audit. Start by identifying your 5 most active custom connectors and look for ownership drift. These are the mission-critical wrappers owned by people who left the company 6 months ago, and they should be your primary targets for the first wave of migration. Moving from consumption prototypes to standard production is a process of hardening your logic. When you move a workflow to the single-tenant runtime, you are not just copy-pasting code, you are replatforming. You have to manage the friction points that do not transfer perfectly, like authentication headers that need a refresh, or triggers that behave differently in a dedicated environment. The most important thing to remember is that your historical run data stays behind in the old multi-tenant storage. You need to establish safe zones for your organization. Define exactly where low-code is allowed to play and where the standard plan is mandated to govern. If a flow stays within a single team for their own productivity, let it live in Power Automate. But the moment an automation touches a VNet, cross-departmental data, or a legacy API, it must move to a standard plan. This is not about restricting your users, but rather about placing your highest value assets in the most secure vault possible. Once you have moved your first pilot, you should start a 30-day review. Measure your success by looking at license reclamation and the reduction in security violations. You can see how much you have saved by moving high-volume enterprise calls from a per-action fee to the fixed compute of your WS1 plan. Use the COE Starter Kit to track the reduction in sprawl, and you will see the fragmentation tax disappear as your architectural debt is paid down. This roadmap moves you from reactive firefighting to a state of proactive control. You are no longer wondering which connector will break next, because you have moved from the old model of user-led chaos to a new model of architect-led stability. You have established a release discipline that treats every integration as a first-class citizen in your infrastructure. It is a shift that pays dividends every single time your system scales. The diagnostic is clear. If your automation is not auditable at the transaction level, it is not enterprise ready. You are building for a world where visibility is the only currency that matters. Stop letting custom connectors dictate your risk profile. Audit your top 5 connectors for ownership drift this week and identify which ones are bleeding your budget dry. This is the first step toward reclaiming your architecture from the chaos of low-code sprawl. If you want to lock in this discipline, watch the deep dive on Azure DevOps pipelines for Logic Apps next. It is the final piece of the puzzle for your deployment strategy. Follow me, Mirko Peters, on LinkedIn for more structural insights into the future of work. Share this with your team if you are ready to move beyond the fragmentation tax. It is time to build for the long term.